Is this on? It is. Okay. What a wonderful crowd. Thank you for coming tonight. I want to thank Skip Rutherford for having me, Nikolai DePippa for all your help, Damas Solomon, my wife Joy is in the audience. Thank you, Richard and Lenora, for having me. You're dearly missed in D.C. So we're going to talk tonight. This might be a little loud, actually. You probably might want to turn it down. We're going to talk tonight about China. And why talk about China? So China is in the headlines, it seems, every day. So it's not just kind of the products that we use, and if we look around the room and look at labels, we see China everywhere. But, if you hadn't noticed, don't look at your 401k, because the markets are a little jittery right now, and a lot of it has to do with China, right? We're also watching political campaigns, and to quote the famous sinologist Donald Trump, China, China, China is killing us. They're stealing our jobs. Now, whatever you think about Trump, the man is putting his finger on a national attitude. Because if you look at the Pew surveys for many years, where they ask respondents from around the world, what is the #1 global economic superpower? What does the majority of respondents respond with? They say China. Majority of Americans say China. Majority of the Brits say China. So Make America Great Again is really touching on a nerve that the sun is setting on American greatness. This is the China century now. And lo and behold, January 1 of 2015, the esteemed economist Joseph Stiglitz wrote in Vanity Fair a piece about the China century, where he said that 2015 will go down as the year when China surpassed the United States in economic supremacy. Sounds about right? And we were looking around at our country, and we see the rise of China, and we think, how can we possibly compete? So I'm here to tell you that the view on the ground in the factories and farms is radically different from what we hear from our economists and politicians and media. And so tonight, in the time that we have, I'd like to discuss with you about China's might in the world, particularly its economic might. And I'd like to suspend your disbelief for a moment. And first, let's talk about, the metrics we use to measure China's might. So, when we say that China's rising, what do we base that on? For years we've been reading in the paper, every article, China, the world's second largest economy, and yet, where do we get that? How do we know that China is the world's second largest economy? Well, that assertion is based on a metric called gross domestic product. Now, stay awake. GDP is a very old metric. It was actually formulated around World War I, and I would argue that GDP is a highly misleading metric to judge the size of an economy. Because what does GDP measure? Most simply, it measures spending. So they add up the spending of the government and the households, minus imports, which we'll also talk about in a moment. And that gives the figure that we often use interchangeably with the size of our economy. So when we say, well, our economy grew at 2.2% last year, what we're talking about is the growth in spending, the growth in gross domestic product. Now, if we were trying to compare how rich we were, we're talking about economic supremacy, right? So we're going to look at our households. Are we going to compare spending? So last year, 2015, it was an expensive year. There was the mortgage and the kids' braces and on and on and on. And I was in the hospital for a while, what have you. So I spent $250,000 last year. But my household, we spent $300,000 last year. Therefore, I am $50,000 richer than you. So that's absurd. But that is the basis for the assertion that China is the world's second largest economy, and why we believe that China is about to surpass the United States. Now, really, if we wanted to compare wealth, we'd look at net worth, right? We'd compare balance sheets. We compare how much we own versus how much we owe. And if we look at America's national wealth, how much our government owns minus what it owes, plus our households, and we compare that to China, America is $60 trillion richer than China. $60 trillion richer than China. And that delta is widening, okay? $30 trillion of value in that delta were created just in the past 5 years. So this is not a country that is nipping on our heels and about to overtake us in the global economy. In fact, they're nowhere near the second largest economy in the world. If you measure national wealth, they're somewhere around France, okay? So when the French stock market hiccups, we don't all get pneumonia. China, we'll talk about why we feel we are getting pneumonia. So let's just take a deep breath for a moment. The long arm of China is not about to grab us and pull us back in the world. Not even close. We heard a funny story about made in China and that everything seems to be made in China today. So our eyes and ears tell us, okay, they're not as rich as we are, but heck, everything's made in China. Just walk down the aisle in Walmart and you see everything's made in China. I can see China on any number of products here. So surely they must have economic dominance in the world. And again, I would say that the way we measure trade is as if I Love Lucy were in its first season. So we're using old economic numbers with GDP, and we're using old trade numbers. So look at how cuckoo this is, okay? We measure 100% of the value of a product from the last place that shipped it to us. So this costs $169 to make, approximately, okay? About $5 of that is from China. The rest are from components that are made around the world, including the United States. Gorilla Glass from the US. Also, some of the chips, certainly the programming and software, the IP. Also components from Japan, South Korea, Germany, etc. Those components are sucked into China where they're assembled, which represents about $5 in value, and then they are exported to the United States. And yet, this is counted 100% Chinese made because they were the last guys that shipped it to us. So if we were to truly count the value of the components in the products that we import from China, our trade imbalance would be more than halved. And that's in goods. In agriculture, we actually have a significant surplus in our sales to China. Same with services, significant surplus in our sales to China. So the discourse in our country, political, economic, academic, media, is driven by metrics that are misleading and sometimes utterly false. Why false? Well, China's GDP figures, are famously fudged. China's own leaders don't even agree. They don't regard their figures as trustworthy. And the reason is because they're a one-party system. Communist Party is in charge, and if you're an official, your career is made or broken by how fast your province is growing. Now, if you think about it, what if the United States had 50 different statistical bureaus? Every state had its own statistical bureau. And let's say that the governor and all the governor's staff were reliant on the growth of that province. they would have a tremendous incentive to inflate the numbers. And lo and behold, year after year, if you add up the GDP numbers from all the provinces in China, they add up to $1 trillion more than the national GDP. It's like the producers, you can't sell more than 100% of anything, Well, in China, they try to, right? It's the same with China's torpid growth. Oh, China's growing so fast. Well, if you add up the GDP growth numbers from the provinces are growing faster than the country as a whole. How is that possible? Because the figures are fictitious. And in fact, if you're doing business on the ground, you'd see that China has been slowing, and in some sectors significantly slowing for many years, since 2008 and probably before that. So if we can't trust the metrics to judge China's might, I ask you, how can we evaluate China's economic might in the world? And I would put it to you that we need to judge China and its might by what it makes. China is a manufacturing juggernaut, a powerhouse. So we need to go to the level of the factory floor to see China's true economic might. And that is where things get very interesting. Because China's manufacturing and agriculture is a black box, okay? Very few people get a chance to see the length and breadth of China's what we call supply chain, the chain that links up all the firms that make things. For nearly 20 years, as an import-exporter and someone who's tried to make things in China for American companies, and now selling things in China for American companies, I've gotten a chance to see that supply chain from raw materials through into manufacturing and distribution. In fact, in 1998, when I started my first firm there, I invested in a small team of engineers. We spent 18 months walking the supply chain, trying to see how things are made in China. What are the differences? So we knocked on doors, and we visited over 600 different suppliers. And since then, we've tried to make just about everything that could be made in China. So I'm looking around the room, and I see return air grills, and doorknobs, and auto parts, and dental bite blocks, all the way up to offshore oil rigs and refinery tank farms. And the common theme between an apple and an oil rig is that China is starkly different from the US. So if anyone's ever tried to make something or grow something, the challenge is that you are fighting physics because things fall apart in the universe, right? So in every phase of production, you're trying to tamp down on the risk that the outputs will be unsafe. That means you try to keep your raw materials safe, and then when they move into manufacturing, you try to keep that safe, and then finally to consumers, you want to make sure that the distribution keeps the product safe as well. We assume that China can make everything that we can, only cheaper, and at the click of a mouse, and that the world is flat. I am here to tell you that this is not the case. And a simple example is actually in this bottle of water. To make a bottle of water like this would take about 4 to 5 firms in the US. So it starts off in raw materials with petrochemical pellets, right? Plastic pellets. And then that would move into an integrated factory. The injection molder would make the molds, the injection molds, to make this cap. And believe me, if you've tried to make these threadings, they're not that easy to make, okay? It's not easy. So they would make the molds, they would make the caps, they would do the blow mold to make the bottle. They would also make the label and do the printing. And then it would be distributed to a wholesaler and ultimately to the consumer. Now, the water that goes in here is another story. And we're seeing this play out on television. That putting safe drinking water in a bottle is not so easy. And we'll get to that in a sec. In China, rather than every node of production being a place where we try to tamp down on risk, every node of production in China is a concentric circle of danger, where the risk that the outputs will be unsafe is magnified at every juncture. How can I say this? Well, if you're a mom in Beijing, you would know, because we don't see it in America, but there have been thousands of safety scandals in China just over the past few years, touching every corner of their economy, from food to drugs to toys to tires to infrastructure, and on and on and on. And we've seen some of these scandals, right? 300,000 babies with renal failure, over an industrial chemical in baby formula. But most of these thousands of scandals we don't see. And if you were in China, you'd be reading the paper, and the Chinese authorities would say, well, this is just a few bad apples, right? And, this guy is to blame. So let's take him out back and shoot him, which often happens. But nothing else to see here, folks. Move along. What I have found, and what I'm trying to maintain, is that the entire system is to blame. It's not just that one guy who's corrupt. China is systemically risky, and that is the reason why we see thousands and thousands of safety scandals. So if we had to walk the value chain of this bottle, we would see that in China, the very raw materials are risky. So whether that is contaminated heparin crude scraped from pig intestines, right, that go into blood thinner that gets sold in American hospitals, that's a risky raw material that's tainted at the beginning of the chain. Or whether it's iron ore that's dug from the ground that has 16% iron content as opposed to 67% iron content where you see the rest of the world, that's a risky raw material where the outputs are steel that shatters. Or it's an apple that's been doused in arsenic. So risky inputs then move into a chain that is not 4 to 5 players long. Okay, we forget we're the beneficiaries not only of 400 years of evolving corporation law, but freedom. The free flow of goods and people and capital have enabled our country to have a fairly rational, fairly safe system. Not so in China. To make any given product, it will take 15 players, 20 players, whether it's an apple or an oil rig. And every single player that touches the goods adds risk that the outputs will be unsafe. Why? Because companies in China are not governed the way companies in the United States are governed. So we assume that when we work for a company, that there'll be certain basic blocking and tackling that is done. So roles and responsibilities are defined. There's a clear line of reporting. There's accountability. Whether you're dealing with a multi-billion-dollar state-owned enterprise in China or a tiny farm, most likely you will find a company that lacks these basic corporate governing skills. A great example is when Shell Oil tried to source a submersible hull from China's best, brightest shipyard. So, policymakers and think tanks in Washington wring their hair over all the subsidies the Chinese government gives to its steel industry. They're creating companies that we can't possibly compete with. So Shell does this audit on the shipyard, and they basically do a full-body cavity search, corporate style, and they find that the shipyard flunks every single requirement of Shell. One, they lack basic roles and responsibility. They lack clearly defined accountability and lines of reporting. You cannot create safe products if you don't have a transparent, well-run company. It's not possible. But also they found that this shipyard, which by the way is a multi-billion-dollar shipyard in value, that they lack the process to monitor and inspect their upstream suppliers. So a shipyard is like a giant Lego assembler. They take these parts and they put them together. So they lack the ability to inspect the inputs. Not good. They lack the ability to handle hazardous materials. They lack the ability to handle defects. You're building like $1 billion superstructure offshore drilling rig and you don't know how to handle defects. They lack the ability to have front-end engineering. When you're putting together a giant submersible hull, you got to do a little engineering up front. And this is not a unique case. Talk to the California Transportation Authority, which decided to forego Obama stimulus money so that they could source the football field long deck spans for the San Francisco Bay Bridge. And what's happening? The welds connecting the decks are cracked. And the inspectors, the American inspectors on the ground, were throwing up red flags. Stop, stop. There's random quality. Random. Why? Bad governance. Unsafe inputs. What did California do? Fired the inspectors, loosened the tolerances, and said to the press, this is a giant corporation. How could they be a fly-by-night operation? Well, when you work with big companies in China and small, they tend to be what would be in our book a fly-by-night operation. So, this is good news for America, and it's bad news for America. The systemically risky value chain in China creates great danger for us. I would maintain that we focus on the wrong threats from China. Let's not talk about currency anymore. Because if you look at what is the argument? With currency, you heard in several presidential cycles, including Romney and onward, that when China keeps its currency value low, right, it makes its products more competitive and therefore kills American jobs. If you look at the value of the renminbi, China's currency, over the past 25 years, and you compare it to American employment, there is zero correlation, okay? When the yuan is cheapest, we are adding jobs in our economy. And when the yuan is more expensive, we're still adding jobs. I mean, if you look at our job trend, it's mostly adding jobs except for blips like recessions and the 2000 blip, which we're actually recovering from now. But it has nothing to do with the value of China's currency. The threat from China is the threat to our health and safety. We imported 4 billion pounds of food from China last year. Okay? We inspect maybe 2% of it. Now, on the China value chain side, we got unsafe raw materials moving into risky firms in long 15 to 20 player chains that are then regulated by a broken regulatory system. That's the last line of defense. China's regulators are also broken and fragmented. So the civilian nuclear power industry is overseen by 14 different ministries and authorities, not one. Every portfolio is like this. It's divided among many, many different ministries and authorities, which are all elbowing for dominance and control and revenue, by the way. And there are also gaping loopholes in Chinese law, so that if you're a chemical company, you're actually allowed to make drugs and not be regulated by the Chinese Food and Drug Administration. So the scandal when glycerin, poison glycerin, was made in cough syrup that killed hundreds of kids, when they walked the supply chain back, they found that it was a chemical company that made it. So the Chinese FDA said, well, we have no authority to regulate that chemical company. So 4 billion pounds of food, and guess what? Next time you take an Advil, think about the active pharmaceutical ingredients that go into the medicines that we take every day. Okay? 80% of them are imported. And most of that is coming from China. The rest of it is coming from India, and guess where they're getting it? From China. So heparin was one great example of the danger, the lethal danger, that Chinese active pharmaceutical ingredients pose to Americans. Food is another. The San Francisco Bay Bridge on infrastructure, and drywall, and faulty ignition switches, and toys, and tires, and apples in our apple juice, which time and time and time again are found to have arsenic in China and yet make up the majority of the apple juice concentrate that goes into our apple juice. 90% of the ascorbic acid that we take in vitamin C, guess where that comes from, and on and on and on. So this I would recommend we focus on. This is what the threat is from China, not currency, not economic supremacy, danger to our families. But there's also an opportunity. So as China struggles to make safe stuff, where are they going to buy them from? If you're a mom in Beijing and you see that 300,000 babies were just poisoned from Chinese baby formula, and you're at the shelf, and let's see, here's some Chinese formula and here's some American formula, what are you going to buy? Even if the American formula is double the price, what are you going to buy? Now, the funny thing about the slowing Chinese economy is this, and it is slowing, by the way. China is the mirror opposite of America. They're great savers, right? We're great spenders. We borrow, they save. So even as China is slowing, they still got to eat. They still got to power their economy. They still got to get around. And that puts America at an advantage because they need what we make. And you say, well, we don't export anything to China. Guess what? Exports from Arkansas to China tripled, more than tripled over the past 10 years. More than tripled. And that's not an outlier. If you look at the level of the congressional district, state by state, you would see that 92% of all districts, that's 401 out of 435, have at least doubled their exports to China in the past 10 years. Most of them more. Most of them more. And most of the companies that are actually exporting are small to mid-sized enterprises. Why? Well, let's go back to melamine and the baby powder again. When that scandal happened in 2008, dairy exports from the US to China quadrupled. So systemic risk in China's value chain gives rise to demand for American goods. Now, I would argue that Arkansas is perfectly positioned to capitalize on this trend. Why? Because we look at the map of China and we see big country, a lot of people to feed, must be the breadbasket of Asia. Guess what? They lack arable land. They got a lot of land. They lack arable land. How much? You could fit China's arable land on the state of Texas to feed 1.37 billion people, where they just liberalized their one-child policy. Okay? And decades of unregulated, untrammeled industrial growth and deforestation have created an out-and-out environmental catastrophe. Okay? We got problems in Flint. 90% of China's aquifers are contaminated. 90%. Over 30% of their grains are already found to contain lead and cadmium. So the air is unfit to breathe, the water is unfit to drink, and they have no land. And this is the country that's going to take over the world. Oh, okay. So meanwhile, how are they going to feed themselves? Well, lo and behold, China is America's #1 agricultural export market. Why? Because of scarcity and risk. Risk because China's agricultural sector is comprised of 140 million tiny family farms. Hasn't integrated yet. And they're tilled by hand and beast. They're a century behind. So when the outputs of China's agricultural system are coming over to us, they're coming from a primitive system, a dangerous system, but also a system that needs what we make. So this is the opportunity. Look at the #1 export from Arkansas to China. It's ag, okay? China is Arkansas's second largest market for export in general, not just ag. Second largest export market, right behind Canada. So agriculture is the #1 export. And what are we exporting? Well, cotton and soybeans and pork. And you think, well, China just bought Smithfield. How could they need more pork? They need more pork. They're importing thousands of tons more pork a month on top of the Smithfield acquisition. And guess what? Y'all reading the paper about rice. They're finalizing the deal to open China's market for American rice. So that'll be a huge win for Arkansas rice growers. Aquaculture. I mean, I hope you've all eaten, because if you looked at a Chinese aqua farm, it is terrifying. In many cases, the chicken coops are over the fish. And what are the fish fed on, you wonder? Chinese know this. So if they have a preference, they're going to buy fish from America. Aqua farming is a big part of Arkansas's agricultural sector. So selling catfish to China is actually a big opportunity as well. But if you look down the list from agriculture, Arkansas is also exporting airplane parts. Why? Well, Chinese consumers are having more money, they're starting to fly around more, and they can't build their own planes very well. The more advanced the manufacturing, the harder it is to make reliably and safely. That is why China is importing aero products from the United States and also investing in American companies that make airplane parts. Arkansas also exports chemicals and forestry products. China's been cutting down forests for a long time. So if you look at the flip side, China is now investing $1.3 billion in a pulp mill in southern Arkansas. Why? China lacks its own forests to make these products. And so they're investing in jobs here to take advantage of our natural resources to make the products that China needs. So before I open it up for questions and assault by some perhaps, I would argue that we need to take a deep breath and look very, very cynically at the statistics that are used to describe China's might, and instead go down to the level of the factories and the farms where we can take a deep breath and we can actually see in the reflection of China that America is not yearning to be great again, but in fact is still great. We are competitive. In my little export company, I am selling American agricultural goods to China at a premium over Chinese prices. It's not a race to the bottom on price. The farmers that I buy my stuff from are making a premium, and the pork processors I'm buying from, Chinese like to eat the stuff that we don't like to eat, so I'm buying the stomachs and the kidneys and the spines and the heads, and that would normally be just rendered or thrown out. So that's adding to the bottom line, right, of these processors, helping to support jobs, and producing something that China needs. So the next century does not belong to Chinese dominance, but Chinese demand. Because we got 1.4 billion people to feed. We've got a government that desperately needs to want to stay in control. And we as America, as a highly diversified, dynamic economy, can make agriculture. We can also make advanced manufacturing. So with China's nuclear power plant boom, where they're trying to green their economy by building all these nuclear power plants, who do you think is designing the power plants? Westinghouse, GE. Who do you think is supplying the parts? 10-foot high valves, for example. Multi-million-dollar fittings. America. Some of these castings are so advanced, they can't be created anywhere in China. So it's China demand that we need to focus on and not economic dominance. And that, I believe, will be the meta-narrative for the next century. And with that, I'd like to open it up for any questions you may have. Thank you. Thanks.
Great. I learned more about Arkansas economics and economic development from him. Great job. All right, questions. Yeah, Rob.
Thank you for meeting with us. My name is Rob Pillow. I'm a first-year student here at the Clinton School. And my question to you is, I definitely buy that the U.S. isn't necessarily in trouble as far as demand for our products go. But can you talk some on how maybe China's regulation policies could set a precedent, so lowering the value of their dollar could set a precedent for other countries to kind of lower their dollars, the value of their dollar, to attract net exports and to grow their GDP. Could you talk about maybe how do we keep that from happening and kind of collapsing our global economy now?
Okay, so we get back into the fascinating world of currency here for a minute. I would like to harken back to the old garmentos in New York who would work the push carts and sell clothes, and they used to say, the best revenge on a lousy customer is to sell them more goods. So if China needs what you make, currency is not relevant, okay? So I've been in the market almost 20 years. And by the way, when I started, I was 6'4", so what does that say about that? All right, so I've been in the market 20 years. I've seen the currency rise, I've seen the currency fall, and yet I continue to be able to sell stuff at a premium. So I would argue that American brand equity and the quality of the stuff that we make trumps price. There's that T word again, trumps price, okay? You know, we seem to think that we're on a race to the bottom on price, when in fact, many companies take their products and sell them in China at a much higher price than what they would be selling for even here. So there's a Brooklyn faucet manufacturer that was going out of business and said, oh, I might as well try to sell it to China. They raised their prices. And they're selling in hotels and casinos and the like. I know a granite manufacturer. So you're thinking granite, a commodity. You know, they're selling their granite in China for 4 times local prices. And part of that is the service that they wrap around that product, because, you know, we're talking about China's transition into a service economy. Not so much, right, when you go to the ground. Whereas if that granite broke on the way, the CEO would be on the next plane to service the account. So I would argue that baskets of currencies may rise and fall in China, you know, and this is getting into the IMF and SDRs and all that, but as China is linking its currency but gradually loosening it, they're actually opening up more problems for themselves, because what happens when China is loosening its currency, it's tanking. And so what is China doing? They're selling treasury bills. You know, like a fireman at an inferno. You know, they're hundreds of billions of dollars worth of treasury bills are being dumped by China. Whoa. Well, didn't Sarah Palin say that China was our slave holder, right? You know, that we have a master here that we are slaves to. They have their boot on our throat because of their treasury bills. So we're seeing right now what happens when China dumps its treasury bills. The dollar is rising in value. Our long-term bond prices are stable, if not going down. And this is why the Pentagon, when they did a study on treasury bills ownership, said that it represents zero national security threat. Because when China dumps hundreds of billions of dollars worth of T-bills, what happens? Other central banks step in to buy. Or we have the capacity to buy them too. So I would say again that American competitiveness lies at the level of our firms, and that if we have a true competitive advantage and sell something that the Chinese really need, and by the way, they need a whole lot of stuff, it doesn't matter what the value of the currency is. And the T-bills issue is another myth too.
Question, yes.
Yes, thank you. Great
Thanks.
talk. Very stimulating. I see 2 things happening. One is the question of the safety and the value in China. How do the masses of people get that information if their government keeps it from them to know to buy the safer products from the U.S.? How does their government admit taking our products in? And similarly, on the other side of the coin, what happened in California where obviously it sounds like a cover-up. And so their unsafe things are coming into the United States and we're not doing anything about that?
Right, okay, so question one, and they're really two sides of the same wooden nickel, I guess. In terms of the masses of China, this is, I mean, we saw the Coca-Cola exhibit at the Clinton Library. It's a Coca-Cola generation in China too. So remember that Pew survey that said that respondents around the world said that China was the #1 economic superpower? Guess what country said that China was not the world's #1 economic superpower? China. Okay. So they're seeing firsthand how at the first sign of an earthquake, their buildings are collapsing or they can't drink a glass of milk that is safe, et cetera, et cetera. And with social media, and I know that China does its best to block news sites and Google and the New York Times, but there's still a long time perception that goes across generations. I mean, Mao imported Buicks, for his apparatchiks to drive around. That's why the Buick is a really sexy brand in China. So America has been looked on as the premier economic superpower that makes safe stuff for decades. And so this is not something new to the Chinese. If anything, we compete more with Germany in this field. Europe, the EU, and granted, I mean, that's a cluster of countries, but they actually export more in value to China than we do. So we could be doing a lot more to be leaning forward and exporting. I mean, in terms of what we import, this is a bit of a cover-up in California because the same Caltrans actually sourced another bridge from the same Chinese company a few years before. And guess what? The bolts from the bridge popped out. And the funny thing is that this company that they're sourcing from is not even a bridge maker. They're a port crane maker. They don't even make bridges. So, part of this, I think, is, and you see this in government as well as companies, folks have drunk the Kool-Aid. They believe in China's might and size. And, if you actually went to that factory and you looked, I mean, it's like a mile-long thing, with thousands of guys scurrying around. And so it's very difficult to get into the internal software of a company and really see how good that company is by corporate governance. HR is slippery. How do you evaluate the HR of a company? Shell does, before they source, but some companies don't. So yes, I would say that if you Google the San Francisco Bay Bridge, and you'll see there was a long line of investigative reporting going after this story, but it was only local. So most of us in America didn't really read about the story. And so part of it was, I think, a cover-up, not necessarily conspiratorial, but, covering your hiney kind of thing. But California is not alone. I mean, look at companies like Lumber Liquidators or, the drywall that we sourced, or even the U.S. Coast Guard, which says that the chains from its anchors snap because they were being sourced in China. So some smart firms like Halliburton, for example, when they're building steel-based structures now around the world, say, okay, China, you can bid on this project, but we're just not buying steel from you. No Chinese steel. And so some companies are getting wise, some governments are getting wise. California hopefully will catch up. I mean, they're talking about building high-speed rail now and getting that from China. If you have not read the article Boss Rail from Evan Osnos, I recommend that you read this article, because the high-speed rail competition with China ain't a Sputnik moment, okay? Their high-speed rail system is, again, systemically risky. And the fatal accidents we've seen in their high-speed rail system were not the results of single points of failure, like a cracked wheelbase, for example, or the driver taking a turn too fast. They were because of systemic risk all along the line, systemic failure in the way that the system was managed, in the parts, in everything. And lo and behold, if you look at how the contracts were actually executed, they would start with a contract worth billions, and then it would be flipped and flipped and flipped and flipped and flipped and flipped and flipped, and everybody's making on the take, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da, until finally at the very bottom, you have literally a crew of line order cooks from a restaurant laying the roadbed for the high-speed rail. Okay, so please, California, like, we don't want to be sourcing high-speed rail from China. And if I could just add, this is also a case study where we think, well, the Chinese stole the plans from Siemens. And so this is a clear example of China leaping over us, stealing our IP, and getting the competitive advantage. And to this I say, you may be able to steal terabytes of data on a stealth fighter, but that does not mean that you can make it. And that does not mean that you can make it reliably again and again and again. And sure enough, if you look at the material hardware of China's military, it is woefully behind. So yes, cyber theft is a big problem, but I am not worried that China is going to take our plans and suddenly leapfrog over our country, because that same systemically risky system needs to make this stuff again and again and again. And our own companies struggle to make this stuff and keep it in budget, right? China, which is generations behind, doesn't have a prayer in trying to make this stuff, to put it into perspective. So, yeah.
Yes, you got a question right over here at the front. Microphone's coming at you.
My name is Jay Mehta. I'm a professor of medicine at the University of Arkansas. I listened very, very carefully to your presentation. It was very nice, very provocative.
Thank you.
I beg to differ on certain aspects with you.
Yeah.
I've had at least 50 Chinese postdocs who worked with me. And I've traveled to China many times. The future of any country is in the young people and their scientists and developers. And I can assure you that the Chinese students work very hard, as you know, much harder than Americans do. Not all, but by a large margin. And if you look at publications today in English language journals, almost half of them are Chinese authors. I think China has a bright future. I think it's going through some growing pains, which is being complicated and propagated by single-party system. But I think China has a great future.
I agree with you, and I am not condemning China to doom or failure, but I would ask you this one question. Where are the elites of China sending their medical school students?
Very good, very good. Many of them are now being recruited back to China. I was in China last April. If you look at Shanghai,
Yeah.
Academy of Sciences, they're doing very well.
They're right, and this again is positive.
Yes.
So America still, I would argue, has the best higher educational institutions in the world, and China has a healthcare system that desperately needs that talent. So this is a good thing. Doctors being trained here, going back to China, which has an aging population, right? Within a few years, they'll have more elderly than workers. But also in terms of technologies like medical devices, which many of our best doctors also develop, despite the indigenous procurement laws in China, which require hospitals to buy Chinese-made medical devices, they buy the medical devices, then they put them in a closet, and they buy the American-made ones. So I am not saying that China is doomed. What I am trying to rebut is the fear that China is taking over the world. And in fact, China is diligent, hardworking, and if you can think about what China has gone through in the past few generations, their own government propagated mass murder on a scale that we have never, ever seen in our country. People still remember this, right? And then before that, there was the 150 years of shame, which they remember like it was last Tuesday. And this actually defines the national character of China in many respects. And so, yes, it is extraordinary what they have accomplished in that time. And please do not misunderstand me. I am not trying to condemn China to a future of failure. But what I am trying to answer is the overwhelming opinion in this country that China has already surpassed America in the global economy, and that the next century will be the Chinese century and not the American century. That's what I'm trying to respond to, but I agree with everything else you said.
Yes, sir.
Mo Barker, I'm with the University of Arkansas, Little Rock. Question really, I'm interested in the nature of the supply chain network in China. The impression we have, there is small companies, sometimes even the mom and pop stores or organization, and often we understand that to do work with China, or you go to Hong Kong, which is a gateway to China, and there are contractors over there that actually have connection with these folks that can get the job done. And of course, you're at the mercy of their whatever they do and their quality control and so on. I don't know if you confirm that or do you see it differently.
What does Hillary Clinton say, that I have the scars to prove it? You know, I have the scars to prove it. That's right. That's true. So often folks say that, well, China's just like Japan in the 1970s, you know, where we used to import lots of sort of unsafe products and cheap products from Japan, but look, they climbed the value chain. If you would read the academic papers coming out of China's premier think tanks right now, you know, so these are the articles that President Xi is reading. The academics are throwing up big warning signs about the hollowing out of China's economy. That in fact, what a very recent, very provocative paper by a leading Chinese economist said that China's economy is nothing more than a pyramid scheme. And that in fact, China is not climbing the value chain and learning how to make higher and higher value stuff, but in fact is essentially outsourcing and arbitraging. So yes, Hong Kong is very much a gateway, partly because they have no import duties. You know, they're a safe and friendly harbor for us. So if you want to export something into China proper, let's say it's milk or milk powder, you know, you're going to pay maybe 25% on top of the value of the goods because of import duties. In Hong Kong, they have none. So many companies will export into Hong Kong before going into China. And if you're sourcing in China, many companies will go into Hong Kong. But again, the problem is that even if you're from Hong Kong, you're coming up against that systemically risky value chain where you have many small players. So the small players are actually an incredible story of the resilience of Chinese small business. Because you've got Mao, who set up the provinces to be self-sufficient with large state-owned enterprises being duplicated in every province. So every province was meant to be self-sufficient, so everyone has its own steel mill, and its own brewery, and its own auto factory, and its own clothing, and this and this and this. So those companies are still there because, you know, guess who runs those companies? Well, it's the brother of the governor, you know, and they employ a lot of people, and they pay taxes. And so the pressure to sort of rationalize and shut those places down is counteracted by the barriers of the provinces saying, no, we need these people employed and we need them to pay taxes. So those large redundant companies are still in place. And then Deng Xiaoping, who came along next, liberalized corporate structure and allowed for a new form of privately owned business called the township and village enterprise, which allowed us to go into business together in a cooperative. And so lots of little companies kind of bubbled up, you know, making clothes and toys and shoes, low capital requirement. And so that plus the redundant firms have caused this systemically risky chain. It's unlike anything that we've seen in Asia. It didn't happen in Japan. And the extent, I would argue, to which China limits the free flow of capital and people, because their financial system is still closed. So the extent that they limit the free flow of capital and goods and people is the extent to which they hamper their ability to rationalize that supply chain. I would argue that you need freedom to do that. And you also need rule of law to do that. And again, China's got a lot of laws in the books, but enforcement, not so much, right? You know, the judiciary and the police and the security bureau, and I should keep my voice down a little bit, but you know, they're all connected with the state. And so what you have is a system that is not conducive to innovation, is not conducive to competitiveness, and is not conducive to economic dominance. If anything, they're holding themselves back as a dominating world power. And that actually makes me nervous, because with all those people, we want a stable China. And the reforms that President Xi is enacting really only scrape the surface. I mean, they're not going down to the root of the problem, which they need to do. And they had a chance to really make some reforms when the economy was growing. And that old saying that when the tide recedes, you can see who's been swimming naked, right? So now we're seeing a nudist colony in China, and time's up. So they've got to make some very, very tough choices on reform. And I'm not sure how they're going to get that done while keeping the lid on security and safety.